Hi, I would like to welcome all of you to our 16th annual Nugent Lecture of the Department of History. And the annual Nugent Lecture, as you all know, is one of our foremost events, significant events every year. And I think it has established itself as the foremost Canadian lecture in history. And over the years, we have had the good fortune of inviting some of the most significant historians of our time. The lecture, of course, is named after Bernice Nugent, who was an undergraduate student in the Department of History in the 1930s, and she graduated from our department in 1938 and left her estate for the department. And her generosity has made not only this lecture and this series possible, but also all the talks and workshops that we organize in the department. That indeed is our good fortune. Our speaker today is Professor Ethan Kleinberg. He is the class of 1958 Distinguished Professor of History and Letters at Wesleyan University, and is currently the Editor-in-Chief of History and Theory, a position he has held, I would think, from 2012. Professor Kleinberg is a scholar of European intellectual history, particularly on the thought horizons of France and Germany, critical theory, and philosophy of history. His scholarship spans across a number of different disciplines and fields, including philosophy, religion, and comparative literature. In his first book, Generation Existential, Heidegger's Philosophy in France, 1927 to 1961, that came out in 2005 from Cornell, Professor Kleinberg engages with the early reception of Heidegger in France, particularly by Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Jean Beaufret, among others. And by doing so, the book illuminates how the work of a right-leaning philosopher was received and influenced the work of left-leaning writers and philosophers in France. And the book argues that it would be difficult to comprehend Heidegger's legacy and influence without first coming to terms with his initial reception in France. The book won the 2006 Maurice Fourcroche Prize for the Best Intellectual History Book by the Journal of the History of Ideas. His rather brilliant second book, Haunting History for a Deconstructive Approach to the Past, Stanford 2017, a book I started reading last night, argues for a ontological understanding of the past. Kleinberg relies on the figure of the ghost as an interlocutor of the liminal space between the absent and the present. The ghost troubles both time and space, leading us to question the very nature of the historical ground on which we stand and the borders by which we divide the past, the present, and the future. His third book, Emmanuel Levinas' Talmudic Turn, Philosophy and Jewish Thought, came out from Stanford in 2021, and the book mainly is based on Levinas' Talmudic lectures delivered in Paris from 1959 to 1989. Professor Kleinberg is also the author of numerous chapters and articles and a highly influential collection titled Presence, Philosophy, History, and Cultural Theory for the 21st Century, co-edited with Ranjan Ghosh. I'll skip the details of many of his honors and accolades, and otherwise there won't be any time left for the talk. But I must mention one of his initiatives that I have found to be essential, urgent, and utterly brilliant. Along with Joan Scott Wallach and Gary Wilder, Ethan started the Theory Revolt and co-authored the Theses on Theory and History. And I must read out two of those theses of the Theory Revolt collective. And the first one is, academic history has never managed to transcend its 18th century origins as an empiricist enterprise. And actually existing academic history promotes a disciplinary essentialism founded upon a methodological fetishism. This excites me to no end. He is currently writing a book tentatively titled The Search, Temporal Anarchy, and the Pursuit of Dynamic History, and his talk today is drawn from this forthcoming book. Please welcome Professor Ethan Kleinberg.
right, no pressure. Let me get everything up and running, as it should be. And let me thank Amitav for the invitation and that really generous, too much, trop introduction. I want to thank Daniel also. It's always great to see him, and I should give a shout out to Layla as well, since, anyone who knows Daniel knows that Layla is the forerunning social media avatar in his life, so it was great to actually meet her after hearing about her so much. And I want to thank Heather and everyone who's made this visit, Tony also, really a great pleasure and just really an enjoyable time since I got here, so that's been great. And I also want to mention, because I just found out today, from University of Chicago Press, that an endeavor that Joan Scott and Gary Wilder and I are doing is going to come out with them, I believe, through their Trios series, and it will be a book called History. It will further the theses on theory and history through 3 interventions by the 3 of us, and also sort of bookended by a reflection on what happened with those theses on theory and history in these 5 years since it came out. And then also publishing them too. So it seemed to be timely, and I do appreciate the generosity of your comments. So I have to, is confess the right word? I guess this happens to lots of us. When you you say what you're going to talk about, months before you're going to do it, and then you start writing it, and you kind of recalibrate it. There has been a recalibration, I think in part because an article I was writing specifically on historicism has already come out, and I thought, well, that would be silly to come talk about something that someone could go read. And in part because where I am with this project, The Surge, coming toward the end of it and finding some new avenues. And specifically, what has come to interest me, at least as the book's concluding, is more about the future in some ways than the past. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about the future, or what in history and theory we've been calling historical futures for the last several years. And well, hopefully you'll see how the way, to my mind, the past plays a very important part in how we determine what our futures are or could be. And the other thing is, I'd been thinking a lot about the idea of North. And in particular, I had been obsessing over a piece by Glenn Gould about the idea of North. And I thought, well, it may be a little too on the nose, but what better place to go at this idea of North in relation to historical futures than this lecture I get to give, which is, for me, the North, although, as you see, there's a lot more northerly one could go. So what I want to do is quickly just give a couple of slides into the anarchy of my mind. That's one of my whiteboards there. That's the project of the whole book, The Surge, as you can see. It actually started to change. For a long time, I thought The Surge was something completely, totally other, but it turns out that's Temporal Anarchy that's totally other. The Surge is a place of mediation, but we'll come to that as we go along. So, what I want to talk about today, though, is this notion of temporal anarchy and the pursuit of dynamic history. And I guess I should add a caveat as I shift my lenses, that I'm doing so in a kind of futural register. So, I'll start by showing my age, because those who are my age, a certain age, might remember a movie called Groundhog Day. Now, for those of you who aren't or don't remember the film, the premise is pretty simple. There's a weatherman who travels to the town of Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, to begrudgingly cover the Groundhog Day festivities, and he gets caught in a time loop where he relives February 2nd over and over again. Now, I suppose a more contemporary reference would be the series Russian Doll, who some of you may have seen on Netflix. The point is, in both stories, the protagonists are stripped of their futures and forced to relive the same sequences. But the repetition of the sequences leads to growth, change, improvement, and then ultimately redemption when the protagonists are released from the time loops and take their place once again in the march of time. So these protagonists become better versions of themselves, and they regain the horizon of a future, presumably because now they are worthy of it. I want to suggest that our current relation to the future is precisely the inverse. While there's nothing impeding our way forward in time, that is, we move from one day to the next and so on, we're blocked from changing our view of what that future is or could be. To be sure, the challenges facing us are every bit as daunting as those encountered by someone trapped in a time loop, probably more so as they're not fanciful fiction. But these challenges are continuously met with social and political solutions designed for futures from the past, old futures. What's more, these past possible futures are ones that failed to solve the problems they were offered to address. As such, there's no growth, change, or redemption that could activate a new future. There's only the rehearsal of the old ones, failed futures from the past. So one important feature of our time loop stories is that the protagonists end up maximizing their extended time, exhausting all possibilities and resources until they are able to escape their temporal prisons. We also are exhausting our available resources. We do that day after day, but we do not exhaust our possibilities. Instead, we seem to rehearse well-known and familiar futures over and over again. And as such, there are no new lessons to be learned, and escape from this endless repetition seems to elude our grasp. We're trapped not in a literal loop of time, but by the ways we project time forward from past to present to future. When we look for guidance or direction, we look back in order to look forward. So in this regard, the current understanding of history, I would argue, is a bit of a trap, a time loop of our own design wherein the apprehension of the past is one that actually forecloses the future. As Sun Ha Hong has elegantly stated it, quote, "The glorious transition from past to future is reenacted again and again, reaffirming the arrow of history. Yet, when the ceremony ends and the incense clears, we find that the promised future remains much the same as before," end quote. Our concepts of the social and political future are derived from concepts of the past, such that our means for seeking solutions remain old ones that persist as an eternally deferred and recycled horizon. Of course, if we imagine our future as a horizon, we've transposed time into space. And this may be revelatory, at least insofar as it demonstrates confusion and entanglement between the point of orientation and the movement it directs. Aleida Assmann argues convincingly that for the time regime of modernity, quote, "the future was for the temporal compass what the North Pole is for the spatial compass, a steady and reliable source of orientation and movement. The future was a continuous promise harboring utopian energy and serving as the telos of a narrative of progress and liberation," end quote. But if the incessant repetition of past futures can tell us anything, it's that this particular understanding of the future has collapsed. What's more, I would argue that these spatial and temporal compasses have long been intertwined. As recently as December 2023, President Dr. Sultan Al-Jubeir concluded the COP28 United Nations Climate Change Conference with these remarks, and I quote, "We leave Dubai with our heads held high, and our work goes on. In unity and solidarity, we will walk the new path that the UAE consensus has set for the world. Together, we will follow our North Star. We will follow it from here to Baku and from Baku to Belém, and together we will secure the future of this beautiful planet for the many generations to come," end quote. The North Star and the North Pole are markers to guide us, not only through space, but also through time in pursuit of a better future, as both Assmann's reference to progress and Algibert's declaration of a secure future for this beautiful planet suggest. And here we see that the compass or beacon of orientation is also meant to be a moral one, a star of redemption. Now, the North Star and North Pole are not the same, although as concepts, they share a common aspiration. The North Star serves as a stellar beacon toward the direction of geographic north, while the North Pole serves as the site of geomagnetic north toward which the needle of a magnetic compass points. Neither of these directional sites is actually stable. The Earth's axis of rotation wobbles over the course of 25,000 years, which causes the Earth's celestial pole to wander and pass over different stars. The North Star is currently Polaris, but about 14,000 years ago it was Vega, and in another 12,000 years or so it will be Vega again. Similarly, the magnetic North Pole moves over time in accordance with the magnetic changes and flux lobe elongation in the Earth's outer core, such that while its location was determined to be the Canadian Arctic in 1831, it has since drifted towards Siberia at an increasing and accelerating rate. I do think it worth noting that the preference for the magnetic compass as a superior mode of navigation coincided with the rise of disciplinary history as a superior mode of counting for the past, with each taking up the mantle of scientific accuracy in the 19th century. A key aspect of both endeavors was the standardization of measurement, focusing on time in the case of history, and the systematic measurement of magnetic intensity in the case of geomagnetism. One might say that the magnetic North Pole came to replace the stellar North Star in the same way that historicism replaced eschatological history. Nevertheless, and perhaps like earlier modes of history, the North Star retained its meaning and valence as a directional guide, especially toward the future, as in the speech at COP28, and historicism has retained its narrative of eschatological progress, although concealed in a sort of objective and homogenous understanding of time. The truth is that while the North Star and North Pole are each stable and effective enough to guide a traveler in need, it's the idea of true north that gives them their power and status as paragons of orientation and direction. In 1967, Glenn Gould's contrapuntal radio documentary, The Idea of North, first aired on CBC Radio, and then in 1970, a video version was broadcast on Canadian television. It's a very strange piece, as hauntingly beautiful as it is highly problematic, and we can talk about that later if we want. In his introductory remarks, Gould asserts his status as one who has long been fascinated by the North, but has had, quote, no real experience of it. Gould goes on to state, the North has remained for me a convenient place to dream about, spin tall tales about, and, in the end, avoid. By contrast, Gould has recorded conversations with 4 people whom he deems to have had real experiences of the North. There's Jim Lotz, a geographer, Frank Valley, a social anthropologist, Bob Phillips, a government official, and Marianne Schroeder, who's a nurse. And there's a 5th participant, Wally McLean, who's a surveyor. And with Wally McLean, Gould shares a more intimate relation, having traveled with him on the 1,015-mile train trip from North Winnipeg to Fort Churchill. And who serves the role of narrator? I should have figured that out in kilometers, I'm now realizing. Oh well. Well, it's through the combined, overlapping, and intertwined reflections of these 5 people that the roughly 1-hour production of dialogue, music, and soundscape unfolds to the basso continuo of the train from Winnipeg to Fort Churchill. Tellingly, the experience of the North is not ultimately what matters, because as with the North Pole and the North Star, whatever the North is to the voices of the documentary, it's something unstable. Indeed, Gould reveals the truth of North in his opening statement, because the force and allure of the idea of North is that it's someplace we haven't been, something we don't understand, and someplace we won't ever reach. It's the fantasy of direction, of knowing which way to go, bound up with the fantasy about the future, knowing where we should be going. Equally important, however, is that true north is a destination we can never reach. The north isn't finding, we're told, about halfway through the program, it's seeking. I think in this sense, true north is akin to the sociologist Niklas Luhmann's future that cannot begin, insofar as each presents a horizon, and here I quote Luhmann, the essential characteristic of which is that we can never touch it, never get at it, never surpass it, but that in spite of that, it contributes to the definition of the situation. Any movement and any operation of thought only shifts the guiding horizon, but never attains it, end quote. This, I think, is the time trap in which we are caught as we continue forward, temporally and chronologically, following an idea we have no possibility of reaching, while restricting other ideas that may lead somewhere else. The freedom of openness that the North promises is impeded by the danger of getting lost in all the expanse, as one of Gould's interlocutors puts it. The unbridled openings and possibilities are curtailed or cut off by the very fear of the openness, the vast openness, lest we lose orientation and wind up lost. We flee the unknown in favor of the familiar, and as such, the direction and future we allow ourselves to imagine is confined to what has come before. Now, this aligns with one of the arguments I make in Haunting History about the aporia of the poros, where the very path, poros, we forge to escape the trap of a vast, disorienting, and seemingly unknowable terrain itself becomes a trap, aporia, when we refuse to leave it for fear of getting lost. The trap which we thought would get us out is when we stay on over and over and over again. In that work, it's the vast expanse of the open ocean that serves as a metaphor both for the past and the endeavor of the historian, who aspires to chart a route or passage over an unruly and at times indistinguishable expanse that churns beneath their endeavors. The chaotic and polymorphous nature of the past provokes anxiety, and in response to such chaos, the historian seeks an ordered way out. The paths that historians construct to bring order and intelligibility to the chaotic expanse that is the past can, however, themselves become impasses when such narrative structures or methodological views preclude other possible voices, vantages, or viewpoints. The pathway forged as an escape becomes a trap. The poros becomes an aporia, restricting one from accessing other possible paths and limiting what can be imagined. Well, here and now, it's the vast and shifting tundra that serves as the metaphor for the future. And I'm suggesting that it's not only the past that becomes restricted when a poros becomes an aporia, but the future as well. Now, past and future are, of course, related, but I want to emphasize the ways that the future follows the same path over and over again, or I would say our future seems to follow the same path over and over again. I believe this is what Luhmann meant when he wrote that, quote, we experience our future as a generalized horizon of surplus possibilities that have to be reduced as we approach them. We can think of degrees of openness and call futurization increasing and defuturization decreasing the openness of a present future. Defuturization may lead to the delimiting condition where the present future merges with the future presence and only one future is possible, end quote. Now, to be clear, Luhmann believed that the structure of our society prevents defuturization from going this far, but I disagree, because the process of defuturization is dictated by a parallel winnowing of what we imagine to have been possible, those kinds of paths. And this is what I mean when I say that past possibles condition our possible past. Our knowledge of the past is conditioned by what presents itself to us, both in terms of its remains and in terms of our reception. The limits of what we are willing to accept as past possibles then conditions what we are willing to accept as possible pasts. That which lies beyond this realm appears to us as simply impossible, such that our limited imagination of the past then decreases the openness of a present future. This is a deprivation of both past and future, so along with defuturing, I would add depasting, in which our inability to imagine different pasts corresponds to our inability to imagine different futures, creating the time loop we are currently trapped in. So the weight and ease and comfort of adhering to old sociopological futures tied to old past pulls us in the same way that the needle of a compass is pulled toward magnetic north. As our actual space is populated and filled and our resources are extracted and exhausted, the idea of a space yet to be populated and resources yet to be found becomes ever more attractive. But as we've seen, this idea of the future is an old one. I think Wally McLean states it, quote, "Ah, yes, but that is, as I say, the North that was," end quote. Nevertheless, it's the only future we've ever known, even though it's also a future in which our belief is waning. Recounting a hypothetical conversation with a young traveler on the train, Wally McLean says, quote, "I don't want to destroy his dream of the North. Also, I don't want to smash my own, which is paper thin at times," end quote. Jim Lotz, the geographer, goes so far as to say, quote, "In the North, we are seeing one of the final playings out of those two great dreams of man, El Dorado and utopia," end quote. And this echoes and modifies an argument from his book, Northern Realities. Now, Lotz identifies utopia with the American West and Manifest Destiny. He identifies El Dorado with the Spanish conquest of the Americas. In both cases, the territories are considered empty spaces to be used to secure a better future through the acquisition of property, the acquisition of resources, or both. This old future, what we could call the modern future, was conditioned by two preconceptions. First, and as noted, a belief that the territories were open and somehow promised to the settlers and colonizers. Second, an understanding of nature as unchanging and unlimited. Now, we have yet to fully confront the ramifications of the first, but we're forced to reconcile with the second as climate change, global warming, and mass extinctions have made abundantly clear that nature itself is historically contingent upon human action, and ultimately finite. Under the concept of the Anthropocene, what once appeared as an unlimited future now appears as the end of days. Even so, the future toward which we continue to be drawn is a modernist one. Our open possibilities have been defutured such that these two great dreams continue to be utopia and El Dorado. Whether through the proposed colonization of space by billionaires or through the promise of technological innovations that restore abundance. And one of the things about artificial intelligence that's on the table right now is if we let it do its work, it'll figure out how to feed everyone. But in the meantime, it's sucking up enormous amounts of electricity and fresh water to sort those things out. And who knows what the solution will be. Well, both expansion and restoration retain the modernist promise of unlimited progress. But they do so by means of a cultural accounting trick that finds a way to write off debts against future earnings even as bankruptcy approaches. In politics, too, the transition to the future is shackled to the past, and one need only recite the Trumpist mantra, "Make America Great Again," itself recycled from Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, which directs us to a better future guided by what had been a better past. Similarly, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland slogan, "Wir sind das Volk," is itself taken from the anti-communist protests of 1989. The Rassemblement National, which is a recycled Front National in France, Viktor Orban and Fidesz in Hungary, the Vox Party in Spain, and the Bharatiya Janata Party in India all offer a vision of the future that is based on a return to the past. Well, such a view is not altogether surprising for right-wing or conservative political parties, but the response from the center and the left is also backward-facing. Liberal parties offer an equally regressive political vision of incremental progress predicated on retaining and modifying existing policies and goals. By promising a future they simultaneously claim they have already achieved, liberal democracies are likewise performing a cultural accounting trick. The debt that is written off is the gap between liberal democracy as an egalitarian promise and the reality of democratic societies as they exist, a reality wherein violence, inequality, racism, and sexism persist. The expectation of achievement posited as having already occurred, and the experience of conditions in the present where it has not occurred necessitate a recalibration of those expectations to accommodate deferral of achievement to the future. But crucially, the path forward is the same one. What is promised is what has already been promised but not achieved. For social democrats and left-leaning academics, the means to rectify the situation and regain authority, ethical and political, is via a return to the older notions of progress and liberation that were likewise part and parcel of the modernity project. An article Susan Naiman published in Unheard called "The True Left is Not Woke" is indicative of this trend. And here I quote from that article. "What concerns me most here are the ways in which contemporary voices considered to be progressive have abandoned the philosophical ideas that are central to any liberal or left-wing standpoint. A commitment to universalism over tribalism, a firm distinction between justice and power, and a belief in the possibility of progress," which all sound good upon first listening. Now, it may be that the means to combat right-wing populism is by reducing conditions of social equality. That strikes me as the most straightforward way. But it's also the case that the ideas offered to do so are a return to the modernist models of growth and progress. True left here is defined as a universalism fostering solidarity, but insofar as those ideas conserve the notion of progress, technology, industrialization, globalization, and the ecological catastrophe this model has wrought, they offer no new solutions or paths forward. The crisis of the Anthropocene again makes clear how the very means of achieving the ideal, infrastructure and increased means of production, are also the cause of climate change and impending disaster. Here, the earlier architects of progress turn out to be also the architects of doom. The closing statement of COP28 likewise demonstrates a future constrained and limited, as the possibility of phasing out fossil fuels, likely the most effective countermeasure against global warming, was deferred, but as such, retains its value as a promise, the same promise to be offered again in the future as a solution to the problem. It's Groundhog Day again. These old promises from an old place are particularly and globally effective because we already know what they are expected to produce or achieve, and because we also expect to be disappointed or frustrated by them when they inevitably fail. We're ready for it. It's the promise of a future that is not intended to be fulfilled and thus can be promised again and again in a never-ending loop. The open possibilities of futurization are sacrificed in favor of a defuturization that pushes us onto the same track forward, and we willingly accept this old future because it's hard, seemingly impossible, to leap into the complete unknown. Who wants to do that? And in this, we're all complicit. Nitzan Lebovic sees, and here I quote him, complicity as the central mode of human operation and the hidden power that continues to move us toward an end. And he argues that complicity comes into clearer view if we understand it in temporal terms. Individuals and communities are complicit when they demonstrate a presentist preference for immediate gain over a devotion to past facts, present critique, and future judgment, or long-term considerations of any sort, end quote. So I think Lebovic is right to point us toward complicity as a key to understanding the short-term and self-serving decisions that seem ubiquitous at this point, but I'm less convinced that presentism is the problem. Or rather, what Lebovic and Francois Hartog call presentism, I would call defuturing and depasting, leaving only one possible future based on an equally limited past. The present appears relentless and endless because the possible futures all come from the same past. Thus, we move forward in time toward an imagined future, but toward the same future as before, cast onto an endless horizon of repetition. Now, according to Lebovic, and here I quote him again, this comes at the expense of both past and future so that multiple potentials may and can be reduced to one, end quote. So what appears as presentism, or it's also been called the broad present, the tyranny of the instant, and the treadmill of the present now, are the result of reproducing a future horizon based on those that came before it. This results in a horizon of past futures that becomes increasingly misaligned in times of unprecedented change, when the familiar can no longer account for or explain away the strange. Younger people experience the old futures as new, while at the same time confronting the cynicism of those who offer these, those who have done this before and know them to be old and know them to have failed, and yet keep offering these old futures nevertheless. And this in turn leads to resentment, disillusionment, and pessimism because the futures on offer are all simply inadequate. In Wally McLean's words, quote, "For those that face it, perhaps for the first or the second or the third time, there's almost a traumatic experience. They feel, this is going to become impossible. It may not be now, but it's going to become so. And yet, they're able to do little or nothing about it," end quote. So, how can we escape the time loop? How can we regain a horizon of positive and open futurization? The problem, as Luhmann frames it, is that any movement in any operation of thought only shifts the guiding horizon, but never attains it. Perhaps escape resides at the end of the horizon, in considering what happens if we do attain it. What happens when we reach true north? Now, the answer is liberating because it's disorienting. At the top of the Earth, the North Star remains directly overhead. Upon reaching the North Pole, the magnetic compass spins randomly or points straight down. The compass becomes useless at the point of contact with its destination, revealing our reliance on a device whose function is contingent upon never reaching its destination. If we do arrive, however, it becomes clear that there's no place else such device can help us to go. Guided by the compass, one will always return to the same place. Following Luhmann's horizon, one can only envision the same future. Of course, if one discards the compass or the horizon, one runs the risk of getting lost. Then again, any space where we are not in control is a space where change is possible, and for me at least, this provides hope. In his Reopening the Future, Emerging Worlds and Novel Historical Futures, Jérôme Bachet looks to offer, and here I quote him, a singular, partly novel modality of the future that forms an open future that is uncertain but possible, and that assumes the novelty while seeking points of support and sources of creative impulse in the past, end quote. One of the keys to this recalibration of past, present, and future is breaking with the understanding of a unilinear, continuous, and unidirectional vision of history wed to the idea of progress, an idea that Bachet claims lent history its greatest glory, and I'm inclined to believe him. Now, I've argued that such a break is much easier said than done, especially if one looks to figures such as Walter Benjamin himself a fish swimming in the stream of the modernist moment, to find an escape path, as Bachet does. So I'm aligned with Bachet and his urgent call to reopen a future predicated on privileging and prizing uncertainty, and I see his call to banish the straight, unique, homogenous line of historical progress as a response to my diagnosis of the aporia of the poros. Bachet's straight line of history is akin to the straight line of the compass or star, steering us north, or Luhmann's horizon, drawing us endlessly forward. The straight lines of north-south or east-west did serve a purpose, just as the straight line of progress once did, but they've become a trap, seducing us to follow the same routes over and over again. I'm thinking of something more radical. My contention is that the events of the past are more temporally dynamic and forceful than most paradigms allow, and as such, require a mode of history attuned to this temporally anarchistic force. Here, time is not a river that flows downstream from past to present to future. Instead, it's a vortex in which past, present, and future events swirl. They are pulled down and pushed up, sucked under in one place to reappear in another, or thrown in who knows what direction. The emphasis here is not on the multiplicity of possible pasts generated by the vortex, but on the temporal anarchy whereby new pasts can open different futures and new futures can open different pasts. This is an unfettered intermingling of past, present, and future. It's free, generous, but it's also dangerous, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about that in the question and answer. Now, the instability of such open possibilities is disturbing, and the organization of time and production of history often serves as an anesthetic that desensitizes us to such jarring effects. There's a moment when time gets organized and deployed as a scale or meter or chronology, after which that organizational scaffold is naturalized in order to be taken for all times. The determination of time in the present is projected onto the past, thus imposing an original organizing principle retrospectively. History as a discipline is currently and still conditioned by a universal, homogenous historicist time that actually smuggles chronology onto temporality, and which has been particularly effective in this regard. But the point I want to make is that the ex post facto organization of time becomes the basis for an explanatory narrative of cause and effect, effacing the temporal anarchy that necessitated the organizing principle in the first place, and in so doing, erasing other possible ways of organizing time and other possible ways of doing or understanding history. The dynamism and unpredictability of the vortex is revealed once the compass reaches true north and its function is disabled. Facing the vortex, but also that which makes the vortex unexpectedly present, the paths forward is undetermined such that something new becomes possible. In Into Cleanness Leaping, the vertiginous urge to commit history, Ilkka Runio argues that the radical discontinuity of the new is, and here I quote him, not a regrettable side effect of our ambition to attain goals that are in line with our identity, but that every now and then we give in to the urge to cut ourselves loose from our moorings, end quote. On his view, such leaps into what he calls the sublimely new most often require extremely bloody events, as the World War I poem Peace by Rupert Brooke, and from which Runio draws his title, suggests. So on this point, I don't agree, because I think the negotiation between past and present open multiple possible futures. What is of interest, for me at least, is Runio's assertion that the urge to commit history and open a new unprecedented future is one that goes against all self-interest, and that the moment when such opportunities arise are best likened to vertigo that causes the sensation of a vortex, maelstrom, or whirlpool. Facing the vortex, one experiences dizziness, but according to Runio, here I quote him again, vertigo is more than just dizziness, because it involves an inclination to surrender to that sensation and to fall accidentally and or unaccidentally. Vertigo may feel like fear of falling, but in reality it is, according to psychoanalysis, a wish to jump, covered by a fear of falling. In a position of vertigo, the sense that the void before you has to be filled may mushroom into something so overwhelming, so oppressive, that you start to fear that you will not be able to resist the wish to jump, end quote. Strangely, the vortex calls and provokes a wish to jump into the unknown, but also the fear of what might happen if one acts upon this wish. And this is what we face when we reach the horizon, when we reach true north. The self-interest of which Runius speaks is the complicity addressed earlier, the complicity wherein we seek safety and control in the face of the radically unknown. The instability of the vortex presents us with new, though difficult because potentially dangerous, unsettling possibilities, and conventional history guides us back to the safe confines of the familiar, if tedious, past and future over and over again. It's also not a matter of looking for other paths, whether in the vortex or in the seeking provoked by north. Generally, one finds what one is looking for. No, what I'm thinking of is those paths that we do not seek or do not want, but that nevertheless come to us. These are the multiple and competing paths that swirl with present and future in the vortex, denying any one path the privilege of guiding or directing the future. It's only by facing the vortex and reopening the past that we can reopen the future and escape the time loop of our endless horizon. When entering into the vortex, we go where the anarchic power of past, present, and future churn in surprising and unexpected ways, knocking us onto a new course. On my account, the paths that lead to this new course are not accumulative, but disruptive. They are other ways that the past can be, and other ways that past, present, and future can swirl together. This is the force that can erupt into and disrupt the present, altering the future. This energy, force, and pressure of the past pressing into the present is what I call the surge. In Haunting History, I describe how at any given moment, a sudden surge can bring evidence of past remains to the surface. Now, in that work, I use the metaphor of the ocean. There's a lot of oceanic in Haunting History, as well as ghosts. I use the metaphor of the ocean as the site of the surge, but one might also imagine a surge of wind, of power, or of sound. Recent films involving the supernatural, ghosts or haunting spirits, malevolent or misunderstood, often signal the arrival of this present absence with a surge of electricity overtaxing the lights, or by a surge of sound, sometimes even blowing the lights up and leaving us in darkness, or reaching a kind of deafening crescendo before leaving us in silence. And here I want to add the magnetic surge of repellent poles. We are, by and large, afraid of such surges, and I would suggest that we are equally afraid of the past. That is at least part of my argument in Haunting History. The surge, like a wave, can come with great force or lap quietly against the shore. It can also generate a powerful current just beneath a seemingly tranquil surface. But nevertheless, the surge is there. When the composing or opposing currents of past, present, and future collide, a whirlpool or vortex is created. On Runia's account, these are the moments when the conditions are right to see the vortex and make history. But Runia's account still assumes a path to the moment of decision, which leads to a separate path, a radically different path, but a path nonetheless, once the leap has been made. I see the surge as a force that knocks us off our paths, confounding presumed linear connections between past, present, and future. Confronting the surge is like applying the compass at true north. The compass of history is disturbed by means of a reciprocal tension between the past charged in a certain way as to become possibly accessible to the present position, and a certain set of present positions, once again charged to be able to attract a certain set of remains from the past. For the mechanism to work, only certain events from the past can be allowed to contact the present, thus creating a strong attraction between past and present, plus minus or minus plus, or in this case, north-south, south-north. If, however, the elements from the past and present are similarly charged, they repel each other and can never completely come together. If one forces them to do so, they are repelled and fly off in unexpected directions. And here we see how those aspects of the past that are repellent to our present are discarded, and how those that are attractive are conserved. This is the winnowing of possible past that dictates what we can imagine as a possible futuring, depasting and defuturing, so the two can come together and seem to hold. And once this depasting is complete, the magnetic force makes the path from past to present appear unbreakable. And this is enforced by disciplinary history's commitment to ontological realism. The focus on the ontological reality of the past further restricts the imaginative capacity of the historian, while also serving to provide a narrow past based on attraction to our present. And this, I think, is what deactivates the future. The surge is the force that breaks this connection by forcing alternative paths upon us. And I think historians need to become attuned to this, and especially to those paths with the energy to repel the magnetic attraction between the present and the past that determines a singular line to the future. Looking over recent works of history, it seems that many agree that we need to rethink what the past is or could be if we hope to reactivate the future, whether through the recuperation of discounted politics or communities, different historical actors and forces, different areas of history to be uncovered, or different historical scales. I believe this is also the basis for the recent fascination with sort of roads not taken histories, as in Bachet's example of the Zapatista, Max Tomba's Insurgent Universality, and my friend Gary Wilder's book Freedom Time, which each attempt to recuperate and reanimate past political moments to activate a new and different future. As Bachet puts it, quote, "What we were talking about here are not small differences, but radically distinct ways of being and acting. They imply an ontological multiplicity with room for animism, totemism, and analogism, with the vast range of their variations and the novel hybridizations among them." I suggest that we consider this plurality of other pasts through what I like to call hauntology rather than ontology, so as to emphasize the spectral nature of the past as absent and present, here and gone, real and unreal at the same time. The ghost forces one to question what is real, that is, what reality is and what it can be. It is one thing to replace an existing path with another, but to reopen the future and escape our time loop, we need to leave the path entirely. We cannot follow the old compass pointed in a new direction while still being silently guided by the idea of north. Hauntology here means putting epistemology before ontology, to consider the conjuring of our world before the naturalization of it as ontologically given. At true north, at the end of the horizon, at the vortex, reality comes undone. And here we can shift the focus from ontology to ontologizing. What I imagine here is not making the world up out of whole cloth, but taking the haunting nature of the past seriously and letting it guide us to someplace other than the coordinates we assume we must follow. Deviating from true north and letting the past take us somewhere else, constructing a new compass of history. So the compass I propose, you can build your own, but the compass I propose is a surge detector that seeks the site of political and ethical intervention, when issues from the past return in ways that connect to immediate concerns, but also repel us from our attraction to old past that dictate the same old futures. This understanding of history and mode of argument is predicated on the moment before the orderly organization of time and the categories of past, present, future. The anachrony of the surge appearing via the vortex, this unrestrained mingling of past, present, and future, is surely disorienting when compared to the seemingly atemporal neutrality of a magnetic compass pointing north. But the compass and the North Star have surely trapped us in a time loop that is conditioned by what has been. And the old modes of history can take us only to the same place. The new compass of history is not restrained by what has been, but attracted to what can be, pointing us toward the possibility of multiple pasts and thus opening multiple futures. Directionality here is not predetermined, and what we consider to be our lodestar, our star of redemption, can change. Here, the future is not considered as a forward moment of progress, but a melee of movement in which the past intercedes into the present and the future itself can change the past. Crucially, the radically distinct ways of being and acting are not restricted to past events or actors, but also applied to the ways we organize time. This plurality of time and temporality forces us to question the currently axiomatic understanding of chronology as fused to temporality, depolarizing the magnetic attraction between a negatively charged past and positively charged present. To become worthy of a future, we need to change, like the protagonist of Groundhog Day. And this means deactivating the delimiting condition where the present future merges with the future presence and only one future is possible. Doing so requires the bravery to face the freedom of openness that characterizes Runia's leap into the sublimely new, or the allure and fear of the North. It's true that the future will appear as a generalized horizon of surplus possibilities that will have to be reduced as we approach them. But it's the reactivation of the surplus that we seek at this moment, refuturing rather than defuturing, imagining the endless horizon as radically open and unshackled from true north. I'd like to think that the future starts now. Thank you very much. I mean, one reason that I point to either historical futures or what I was calling social and political futures is because actually there's really some interesting and different work being done, especially through things like Science and Society, but overway in sort of the deep tech AI side of very different notions of what the future is that's completely, in a way, constructivist, radically constructivist. And I don't necessarily want to put them in the same basket. And so it's the futures that really, and this is sort of shows to the power and the potential of what disciplinary history can do, but also the way it then is sort of activated to limit ourselves is an interesting problem. That history, even though people seem to claim that it's falling from enrollments or is not that important, has been appropriated to make a lot of these cases, not actually to do anything new, but actually to show why we shouldn't do anything new or different. And I think that's a hijacking of what history is or could be. So that's one reason I try to delimit it. But the other thing, and I guess I'll jump, because maybe then I'll backfill some of these. I'll jump, the idea that what I'm calling for might very well be a different discipline is entirely possible. But I would say rather than thinking of it as sort of an extinction narrative, I would say history was something very different before the 19th century. And it followed a different set of rules. And in fact, many of those rules were not about the kind of neutrality and objectivity and pushing away of things like either myths or literature that we're so obsessed with in our current state. In fact, it was using those sorts of tools, even though they wanted to have the most accurate history possible, to be able to inject something like a morality tale or a normative argument or a political argument into it. Well, when that went away, we ended up with kind of a hidden agenda based on progress that had all those things, but all of a sudden the historian wasn't responsible for it anymore. Not me. I'm just empirical. I'm just following the facts. But as Hayden White, among others, show, the narrative implotment alone often would be the tell as to what the historian was up to. So does empiricism have to go away? No, empiricism doesn't have to go away, but it needs to account for itself. And if you think about this model of the vortex, the idea is there are competing ways of organizing a past and competing logics of what history could be. And if, in fact, you have to run yourself up against those other ways, those other epistemologies, take them seriously instead of hiving them off, then, of course, that's a very different account. Maybe that leads to hybridization. Maybe that leads to change. Maybe that leads to precisely a very different sort of history that would be unrecognizable to what we consider disciplinary history today, in the way that perhaps disciplinary history today would be unrecognizable to Herodotus. I'm not sure. I guess last, the metaphors. I like to traffic in metaphors, in part because I like to have things that are sticky that people can grab onto, that they can think about, that they can actually think about what, because the metaphor travels, right? It travels in ways and it travels to different places, and perhaps it travels so other people will do things with them. The compass of history I propose, I hope, is not going to be the compass of history that other people are thinking of. In fact, the aspiration here is that there's going to be multiple competing ways of trying to work this out. And I think a metaphor is, well, it can be a useful way of doing so, but I also just like it for talks. So there's an aesthetic function as well. Yeah, well, so so one thing I would point you to is this recent article, Time Scribe, Deconstructing Historicist Time, because I take up some of those issues in precisely the way that the historicist moment is one that tries to step away from the Enlightenment insofar as it no longer wants to make universal claims. It only wants to make particular claims. And that's a huge difference, and so one shouldn't put them both in the same basket. But I would also say that it's unfair to cast the 19th century. It's not the 19th century qua 19th century that's the problem. It's actually a historicist understanding of temporality, which isn't just happening at the time of Ronca. It precedes Ronca, but it has to do with a synchronization and gathering of time as one thing that should be exported, that then gets fused to, by the time you get to like Popper, with the Hegelian notion of progress. And so that all gets put together, and the problem with it is, as I was trying to suggest, is what even in Ronca and Droysen are in the end normative arguments about whether historians should be involved or not involved, with Droysen saying, yes, they should just say what they're doing, and Ronca saying, no, we should try to efface, we can't do it, we can't succeed in doing it. Ronca gets a bad rap that way, but we should try because that's the best way to tell a history. Those explicit understanding of what the normative argument is gets dropped out, especially in the United States American case, where those two thinkers are conflated, and it ends up being a radical kind of neutrality that's postured. That Noble Dream, Novick's book's very good on this, to demonstrate the way that then that's what absolves historians of responsibility. And it's not to say that there aren't particular historians who do take it up and try and make political or moral arguments, but in fact, the temporal scaffold on which they're working is a hard one to get out of. Even in the way most of my arguments are constructed, I realize that I'm traveling that road and building it. And that's why I think only a deconstruction can deactivate it, because you have to show the way the different sides of the argument, which are actually opposed to each other, the universal claim and the particular claim, are at play. It turns out, spoiler alert, the universal claim of historicism is that homogenous time is timeless. Like, it's applicable at all times and all places and can always be used. And that actually turns out to not be a culturally specific historicist claim at all. It's the Enlightenment claim. So there's something going on there that's actually quite binding. And that's why something like a vortex or a temporal anarchy, to get to the moment before the organization, I think is warranted. Because then you have to think, how was this organized? I know historians don't like to do all this kind of philosophical heavy lifting, But I do think it's warranted that they think about the chronological and temporal scaffolds they take to be axiomatic as to why that's the way they're organized at time, especially if you're doing global history. And you're going and saying, well, I'm imposing this kind of time upon these sorts of people in this sort of place without first asking a question that's usually in anthropology, well, what kind of time in history did they organize this by? And how would that make mine different if I put them in play? And so that's the kind of recalibration I'm asking for, but it does come with some cost. The cost is the sort of surety, and the cost is the danger of dropping into something that may very well take more than one or two sailors, depending on what happens. I mean, that's the danger part. On the back end of this, the kinds of values or norms that I hold, or perhaps that each of you hold, are not necessarily the ones that are going to come out on the other side of the vortex. Now, I would say that's horrendous, except for I think right now in this political moment, that's happening anyway. I mean, the Supreme Court of the United States is like a perversion of the Cambridge School of Intellectual History in their arguments about orthodoxy and their citations of history to justify their arguments. And methodologically, you could say they're right on, except for it's done completely in bad faith. But you're not going to be able to take them on methodologically because it turns out they're doing the same thing. They're just doing it in bad faith. If that's what's going to be the end of this, I'd say let's get ahead of that. Let's at least pull up and say, whoa, we're going to need other tools to fight them if the ones we've been using before are the ones that they're also using. So I'm not as scared of the dangers as I might have been at another time. But I mean, if I went back to the beginning, the first chapter of this book is called The End Time of Truth. I think it's done. I think it's done. That's a very big question. Fortunately for you, I've been reading a lot of analytic philosophy, McTaggart and Russell and some physicists. It turns out what the multiverse people think isn't at all what I'm doing at all, because that never touches. So none of this would work sort of because I'm working actually not in a multiverse. I'm working with one world. However, I think, this is me, I think we've confused time and temporality. And I think that's, especially historians, but I think philosophers have done that too. And if you think about, so McTaggart makes a quite radical argument that time doesn't exist.
I think that.
Yeah, so he does. He's like, it doesn't exist at all. It's completely wrong-headed. And then Bertrand Russell goes, no, yeah, time exists. The problem is that there's what we can call A series and B series time. And A series time is like something happens going along where we could say before and after would be a way to put it, and that would be a good way to do it. It says the problem happens when you start adding tenses in, like past, present, and future, because that creates confusion, and then that confusion begets things like chronology, and then you start situating things as they have to happen. So what Russell's argument is that if you get rid of tenses, it solves the problem. I don't know if that's true, because then the historian would have to write, well, actually for a long time, many historians did do this. Caesar came after X, but before Y, and that's how you would do it, instead of saying, in the past this happened, in the future that happened. Now, the analytic argument is one thing. What interests me is that I do think temporality is our relation to time, and that you can have multiple kinds of relations to time. So if we accept time as existing in this sort of rudimentary way, it's the organization of time that is the part that gets fascinating. And I can't remember who, but someone said that like historians fall into narratives like apples fall from gravity. We just tend to go there and do that and organize it, and we've always done that. But that turns out to be sort of one way of imagining how the time can work. Whereas actually, if you're thinking about Homer or an in media res, you could start at the beginning and work your way back. And I guess a historian could do that too, but not many of us do. So the temporality part is the one where you could have multiple radically different kinds of ways of envisioning it, and there's going to be entailments on how you decide to envision it. So it's that more anarchic notion that there's a rudimentary thing going on. But in fact, that thing going on, we don't really understand it. Philosophers don't understand it, and physicists, it turns out, don't understand it. And it may be anarchic. And like when you get into the physicists, they do think it's it's possible you could punch through time like in Dune. Whether we can do that, I don't know. But these are possibilities. They're theoretical possibilities, but they're mathematically plausible possibilities. So why not lean into that a little bit? and to think about the ways we can organize it. So that's a long, well, I don't know if it actually answers it, but it tries. That's what I'm trying to do right now, is figure that part out. It's above my pay grade.
So I'd say there's two questions there, or at least I'll give two answers. One, in terms of the sources, I think it's already the case that historians have actually opened up far more notions, a greater sense of what a source is or it can be, although we still have a fetishization of a source. Source and text is a weird combination. Like we have this great example of the Ship of Fools, the Brandt text in the Wesleyan Special Collections. But if you look at it, it's all marked up and people wrote in it and just made notes of like where they were going. Because at one point it was just a book that someone had. It was a text and you could write into it. When it went into Special Collections, it became a source. Now I have to wear gloves and a mask and I can't write anything in it and I have to treat it very carefully and it's become a magic object. I do think we should reflect upon the way what we do when we create the sorcery of a source. There's something going on. So that fetishization is worth considering. But the plurality of sources, I think, is much greater, and the ways of treating archives, I mean, it should always be skeptical. If there's one thing that we learned from source criticism, like that you would take from the 19th century, which I think we all should like lean into, is the idea that you're going to like just wring the source to make sure you think it says what it says it says. You know, you have a kind of skepticism and you're trying to read against it, or you're bringing in other things and you're trying to sort of dislodge that. So you're going in with a hermeneutics of suspicion to begin with. And it's not because it's a source in an archive that it lends its authority. I think we've sort of lapsed into that, or some have lapsed into it, but I think most historians don't do that. That's where we're really good. Like going in and saying, I don't trust it, I'm gonna figure out what it is, figure out what it means, I'm gonna figure out if it accounts for the people it says it accounts. I mean, E.P. Thompson, of course, showed us all how to do this. We can find something else by looking at it. So I'm probably more optimistic about what historians are and can be doing with sources than other areas. However, I don't think that we can do animal history, we can do plant history, we can do all these things, but we're always doing it from a human perspective. And it's presumptive for me to think I can think what a dolphin thinks, I would argue. I mean, there's other things that are presumptive of me to think too, but that one in particular. And so I do think that we should be working hard to expand the field and change and open the kinds of actors and actants that are historical agents. But I think we also have to be humble about when we're ventriloquizing and when we're trying to just present an alternative notion of what history can be. I don't think we can outrun our own entanglement in the historical endeavor, which isn't to say that dogs don't have histories. They surely do. I just can't say what they are from my position as I just don't know. I wish it did sometimes.